The sun had not yet risen over the Mercer plantation, but the air already trembled with tension. The fields were silent, the usual chorus of crows and distant cattle subdued as though nature itself feared what would unfold. In the big house, Nathaniel Mercer ran his morning inspection with the cold efficiency of a man who believed in absolute control. His whip, polished and coiled, rested against his shoulder like an extension of his arm. By noon, it would taste the skin of 5 slaves, each of them chosen not for crime, but for defiance or the faintest trace of it. Eli, the tallest among them, bore scars from previous lashings. His back was a map of Mercer's cruelty, yet his eyes held a spark that no whip could touch. Jonas, quieter and smaller, moved with a careful grace, avoiding any gesture that could be construed as insolence. Miriam, the only woman among the 5, held her head high despite the fear that had curled in her stomach since sunrise. Samuel and Tobias, brothers by blood and by bondage, exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Survival required more than compliance. It required cunning. Mercer's footsteps echoed on the wooden porch as he approached, whip coiled like a snake ready to strike. "Line up," he barked, his voice sharp and absolute. The 5 stepped forward, shoulders squared, hearts hammering. They knew what awaited them, yet each carried within a seed of quiet rebellion that Mercer had never noticed, never could notice. As he cracked the first whip against Eli's back, the sound tore through the air. Flesh split, a hiss of pain and anger mingling. Eli didn't cry. He gritted his teeth and counted silently, every strike embedding a promise, a plan forming in his mind even as his body trembled. Jonas went next, the whip painting his skin crimson in arcs that Mercer thought signaled submission, but in truth only fueled the fire that burned behind Jonas's calm exterior. Miriam's turn came, and though her scream echoed through the fields, it was not of surrender, it was a chant of determination, a prayer to survive and endure beyond Mercer's walls. Hours passed, each lash a rhythm of cruelty. Samuel and Tobias, whipped in succession, carried the weight of their shared resolve. Mercer, drunk with power and hubris, failed to notice the subtle signs. Small threads cut from their clothing, sharpened stones hidden in the soil beneath the whipping post, and the careful placement of ropes and hooks, seemingly mundane, waiting for the moment when his own tools of domination would be turned against him. By afternoon, the 5 were bleeding, battered, yet alive, each whispering a silent pact to one another. No mercy would be given back to the man who had taken everything from them. They were slaves in body, but in spirit, they had begun a plan that Mercer could not see, could not imagine. The whips, instruments of terror, had been handled carelessly, and each one now carried a secret mark, a small notch, a tag, a thread of preparedness that would turn the tools of punishment into agents of justice. The sun sank low, casting long shadows across the fields. Mercer, satisfied with the obedience he had extracted, ordered the 5 to the quarters. "Rest," he commanded, unaware that by nightfall, his whips would no longer serve his tyranny. They would bind him, choke him, and remind him that cruelty always carries consequences. As darkness fell, the slaves moved quietly, gathering the coiled whips with hands that had been broken but not bowed. Every knot tied, every loop arranged, was a testament to patience, precision, and the quiet vengeance that had been nurtured during the day of pain. Mercer's arrogance had blinded him to one immutable truth. A man who wounds without thought will someday be wounded by the very instruments of his pride. Night deepened. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of rain and the faint metallic tang of anticipation. The 5 stood together, bodies aching, hearts synchronized in purpose. When the clocks struck the witching hour, they would act. Mercy had been denied to them, but tonight, justice would be claimed. And Mercer, confident in his invincibility, would soon learn that the same tools he used to dominate were now his undoing. The whips, coiled and prepared, hissed silently in the darkness, ready to turn against their master a final lesson in cruelty's inescapable return. By dawn, the sun would rise not on submission, but on a reckoning. Mercer's arrogance had tied the noose himself. his hubris reflected in the leather cords that would soon mark the end of his reign over those who had long endured his tyranny. The quarters were silent when the five returned, their bodies stinging with every movement. No one spoke. Conversation would only waste the breath needed for what came next. The door shut behind them with a soft thud, and in that dim, airless room, something ancient stirred unity born from pain. Eli was the first to break the silence. "Tonight," he whispered. "Not a question, a declaration." Jonas nodded, pulling a small wooden peg from beneath his sleeve. It was nothing more than a sharpened scrap carved from the handle of a broken hoe, but in his hands it was a key, a way to dismantle the locks that held Mercer's tools, the same tools that had fed the man's thirst for power. Samuel and Tobias crouched beside the cot, lifting a loose floorboard. Beneath it lay the things they'd hidden over months, pieces of rope they'd stolen strand by strand from the supply room, metal hooks that had once hung lanterns, and the 5 whips Mercer had used earlier that day. Miriam had gathered them while tending the post, her hands disguised as trembling from pain. She held them up now. The leather was cracked with blood, some theirs, some from earlier punishments, but tonight the whips looked different. They were no longer symbols of defeat. They were weapons. "Each one goes back to him," Miriam whispered. Her voice was hoarse, but steady. Eli traced a finger along the whip that had torn into him. "He carries 5, he said. "He'll fall by 5. The window creaked softly as Tobias opened it. Cool night air drifted in, mixing with the heat of fear and determination. Outside, the plantation was asleep. The dogs lay chained, too old and slow now to patrol. Mercer had dismissed the night guards months ago, believing fear alone would keep his slaves obedient. He never realized fear can rot. Jonas peeked out into the night. "Barn first," he murmured. "We set the rope there." They slipped out one by one, shadows moving through deeper shadows. The moon hid behind clouds, as if aiding them. Grass brushed their ankles, damp from dew. Every step was a prayer and a promise. The barn stood tall against the night, its wooden walls sun-bleached and weary. Inside, lanterns hung unlit. The horses shifted restlessly, as though sensing the tension. Eli motioned for them to spread out. "We tie the first knot here," he ordered quietly. Samuel and Tobias worked quickly, looping one of Mercer's own whips around a thick ceiling beam. Jonas secured the ends with the metal hooks, while Miriam tested the tension. The leather groaned, but held firm. "That's one," Tobias whispered. The second whip went near the doorway, the third near the loft ladder. Each was placed with calculated precision. Each loop was a snare waiting for Mercer's arrogance to step into it. By the time the 5th was set, the barn had transformed from a storage room to a trap disguised as stillness. But the plan wasn't complete. "He sleeps light," Miriam reminded them. "We get him to the barn. He must come by choice, or by voice," Jonas said. "He comes running when he hears trouble." Eli took a breath as a thought formed, heavy and dangerous. "A scream," he said. A cry loud enough to draw him. The group exchanged a look, fear mixed with acceptance. Someone would have to be bait. Before anyone could volunteer, Miriam stepped forward. "I'll do it," she said. Tobias shook his head. "You took the worst of it today, and that's why he'll believe it's me again," she said. "He likes when the weak break." Silence fell. No one could argue because she was right. Back at the quarters, they prepared the final piece. Eli placed a stone against the wooden door frame, ready to strike it hard enough to splinter the wood and mimic a struggle. Jonas rehearsed the scream with Miriam sharp, panicked, desperate but not true. None of them slept. When the moon reached its peak, Miriam stood by the doorway, breathing shallowly. "Ready?" she whispered. Eli lifted the stone. The crack rang out like lightning, splitting a tree. Miriam screamed, a sound ripped from the depths of someone who had suffered too long. It tore through the night, bounced off the main house, slid under doors, and pierced Mercer's sleep like a blade. Inside the big house, Nathaniel Mercer jolted awake. He grabbed the nearest lantern, his favorite whip already in hand. Anger, not concern, lit his steps. They dare try something at this hour? He snarled as he stormed outside, boots pounding like thunder. The five hid behind the shed, breaths held, watching him march toward the barn just as planned. The whips waited for him, and so did they. The hour before midnight draped the Mercer plantation in an unnatural stillness. Even the crickets seemed to sense that something in the air had shifted, something heavy, electric, dangerous. The big house loomed against the darkness, its white columns glowing faintly under the moonlight. Inside, Nathaniel Mercer slept soundly, drunk on whiskey and the satisfaction of pain inflicted. The empty bottle lay on its side, and the 5 whips he had used earlier hung neatly on the wall behind him, each coiled like a serpent waiting to strike again. He didn't know that they were waiting, yes, but not for him. Down in the slave quarters, the 5 gathered silently. Their bodies still stung with raw lashes, but their eyes were bright, fear mixing with fury, pain mixing with purpose. Eli stood in the center, tall despite the blood drying on his back. Tobias and Samuel flanked him, sharpening a wooden wedge and knotting rope fibers more tightly with every heartbeat. Jonas checked the crude latch they'd fashioned for the window, a lock meant to trap Mercer inside once the plan began. Miriam, quieter than the rest, whispered prayers under her breath, not for mercy, but for strength. "Once we start," Samuel murmured, "there ain't no going back." "We already passed the point of return," Eli answered. His voice was hoarse, scraped raw by hours of pain. "This man took our lives long ago. Tonight, we take back what's left." Miriam lifted her gaze. "He won't expect it. Not from us. Only thing he sees is fear. And that," Jonas said, "is what's going to choke him first." They moved with the precision of people who had spent years obeying commands against their will now, at last, using that discipline for themselves. Each of them carried an unspoken memory, a life stolen, a family torn apart, a dream crushed under Mercer's boot. Tonight those memories bound them tighter than any chain ever had. As they approached the big house, the moon dipped behind a cloud, cloaking them in shadows. The porch boards creaked under Eli's steps. He paused, listened, then nodded. Miriam's trembling fingers found the key Jonas had stolen from Mercer's belt while the man was too drunk to notice. It slid into the lock with a soft click. The door swung open. Inside, the house smelled of whiskey, oak, and the lingering stench of the man who ruled it. Tobias and Samuel slipped in first, moving like wraiths across the floorboards. Jonas followed, closing the door behind them. Eli paused a moment at the threshold, steadying himself. His back still burned. His anger held steady. "Let's finish this," he whispered. They climbed the stairs, one slow step at a time. Mercer's snores rumbled down the hallway, a guttural reminder of his arrogance. At the top, Tobias signaled one quick tilt of the chin, and the group moved in formation, spreading out around the master's bedroom door. Miriam reached out first, touching the doorknob. It felt warm, almost alive. She swallowed hard, then pushed. The door opened soundlessly. Mercer lay sprawled across his bed, one arm hanging over the side, his mouth open mid-snore. His boots were still on. His shirt was stained with sweat and alcohol. Above him, like trophies, the 5 whips hung in perfect formation. 5 symbols of everything he had ever been. 5 witnesses to the cruelty he had committed earlier that very day. And 5 tools ready to become the instruments of his downfall. Jonas moved first, sliding to the wall and unhooking the whips one by one. He placed them in Eli's hands. Eli hesitated, not because of fear, but because of the profound weight of the moment. These were the same whips that had carved scars into his back since he was a boy, the same whips that had taken Miriam's sister, the same whips that had broken Samuel and Tobias's father, the same whips Mercer believed would always make slaves bow. "Give me the rope," Eli whispered. Tobias handed it over. Samuel tightened a second coil, making sure the knots were strong. Miriam moved toward the bed, her steps careful. She pressed a hand to Mercer's forehead, checking. The man didn't stir. Drunk. Dead asleep. "Perfect." Eli spoke in a low voice, almost gentle. "He bound us. Tonight, we bind him back." They worked in near silence. Jonas tilted Mercer's head so Eli could loop the first whip around his throat, securing it with a tight knot. Tobias helped with the second. then the third, then the fourth, then the fifth. Each whip looped around the man's neck like a tightening crown. Mercer stirred once, but a swift press from Miriam kept him down. They finished knotting the last whip and stepped back. Their hearts pounded in unison. Their breath trembled. Their hands shook not with fear, but with a release of years of suffering. Mercer had whipped them until their skins split. Now the same 5 whips rested around his own neck, coiled, ready, waiting. "Ready?" Eli asked. "Yes," Jonas murmured. "Do it," Miriam whispered. Samuel and Tobias each grabbed a whip end. Eli took the remaining 3. For a moment, nothing moved. The room was frozen. The plantation was silent. The universe seemed to pause. Then Eli whispered, "Pull." 5 sets of hands pulled backward in perfect unison. Mercer convulsed. His eyes snapped open, confusion turning to terror in a single heartbeat. And the night finally swallowed the scream of a man who had never expected consequences. Night swallowed the plantation whole, not the moonlit quiet the slaves sometimes cherished. This was a heavier darkness, thick and waiting, as if the earth itself held its breath. The cicadas had gone silent. Even the pine trees stood stiff, their needles unmoving. Everything felt still, too still, as though the land knew what was coming long before any human did. Jonas stood at the edge of the quarters, fists clenched at his sides. Sweat crawled down his spine, not from heat, but from the weight of the choice that had finally reached him. Beside him, Ruth stood with her arms folded tight across her chest, her jaw locked. Sam leaned against the post, eyes narrow, quiet. Old Miriam murmured a prayer under her breath, fingers trembling over her rosary. In the center of the small clearing sat a small burlap bundle. Inside it were the 5 objects that would end a dynasty. 5 whips, 5 tools of blood, 5 names etched into leather by the hands of the very man who used them. Master Harrow kept them in a locked cabinet in the barn loft, each whip a symbol of discipline, legacy, cruelty passed down from his father. Taking them had not been easy, but Sam had slipped away while the drunken overseers snored, and the lock had been weaker than anyone expected. Now they lay wrapped in rough cloth, stolen, reclaimed. Ruth knelt and unwrapped them one by one. The first whip, broad, black, thick as a man's thumb, belonged to Harrow himself, the one he used on Jonas that terrible afternoon. Jonas looked at it now and felt a strange emptiness. Not fear, not anger. Something deeper, recognition. The second belonged to Overseer Pike, the third to Dunley, the fourth to Fitch, the fifth to Rourke. 5 men, 5 enforcers, 5 names whispered like curses through every corner of the quarters. Ruth lifted her chin. "Tonight," she whispered. "They get marked." Sam's voice was low. "We ain't never gone this far before." "We never had to," Ruth answered. "But he crossed something that can't be uncrossed." She turned her gaze slowly along the circle. Jonas, Sam, Miriam, Daniel, Cora, Isaac, young Clara, the old men sitting on stumps, the trembling teenagers clutching each other's hands. "He touched the line," Ruth said. "The one that says, 'We still human.'" The group fell quiet. Jonas felt the moment settle into his bones like iron. For weeks, he had tried to push back the memory, the crack of the whip, the white-hot pain, the humiliation, but tonight it returned in full, sharper than before. Jonas stepped forward. "If we do this," he said, "there ain't no turning back." "No one wants to turn back," Cora whispered fiercely. "Not anymore." Ruth placed her hand over the bundle. "They whipped 5 souls till skin split," she murmured. "We survived, but we ain't healed. So tonight we send a mark that don't fade." Miriam looked up then. Her voice was small, frail, almost broken. "If they catch us, they won't." Ruth's tone cut like a blade. "They ain't looking for us. They don't see us unless we break or bleed." The words stung with truth. Jonas felt something shift inside him. Not vengeance alone, not rage, purpose. He stepped forward, lifted Harrow's whip, and held it up. The leather gleamed under the lantern glow. "When do we move?" Ruth smiled, small, grim, certain. "When the house sleeps." Sam nodded toward the distance where the big house stood, its lamps flickering. "Then I'll watch the windows. When Harrow's light goes out, that's the sign." Isaac slowly rose from the stump, voice rasping. Tell me what each of us gotta do." Ruth began assigning roles quiet, organized, as though she'd planned this moment long ago. Sam and Jonas would move first, into the barn, and prepare the rafters. Cora and Clara would scatter the powder near the kennels to keep the dogs restless and distracted. Daniel and Isaac would disable the overseer's rifles, taking the firing pins and burying them. Miriam would stay behind with the children, each task deliberate, each movement designed not for chaos but for certainty. Then came the final order. Ruth stepped to Jonas and placed Harrow's whip back into his hands. "Yours is the last piece," she said, voice low. "When everything ready, you call the hour." Jonas swallowed. "Why me?" "Because you're the one he tried to break," Ruth answered softly. "And the only one he failed to." For a moment, the air shivered with something like prophecy. Jonas nodded, the weight settling into him. Not as fear, but as belonging. The lantern flickered. A breeze crept through the trees at last, rustling the leaves like whispers. It was time. The group dispersed into the dark, silent as smoke. Jonas waited until only Ruth remained beside him. She looked at him with something between pride and sorrow. "You ready?" she whispered. Jonas tightened his grip around the whip, the same whip that had torn his flesh, now trembling in his hand, no longer a tool of pain but a promise. "I've been ready since the day he first raised it," he said. They walked into the night. The hour had come. The plantation would not wake the same. Night had swallowed the plantation whole by the time Lena slipped into the shadows behind the cookhouse. The autumn wind carried the sour tang of sweat, old blood, and the faint burnt hide smell that still clung to the whipping post from that morning's cruelty. 5 ropes still hung from it, empty now, swaying like ghosts of the men who'd screamed beneath them. She had not forgotten the screams. But more importantly, neither had the men themselves. Jonas, Elijah, Abram, Moses, and young Caleb gathered in the dark behind the hog pens, each of them wrapped in silence thick as tar. No lanterns, no whispers, only their breathing, low and steady with something sharper than fear. Resolve. Jonas opened his palm. 5 lengths of leather lay coiled inside like sleeping snakes, the same 5 whips the master had used on them that morning, taken straight from the barn wall the moment he'd stormed out. Lena stared at them, then at the men's faces. They were bruised, cut, swollen, trembling, but their eyes burned. "Tonight," Jonas murmured, voice rough with pain, "he learns what it feel like to be touched by his own hand." Caleb flinched. He was only 17. Ribs still bleeding where the whip had torn him open. "We gon' kill him?" Lena placed a hand on his shoulder. "No," she said quietly. "Not yet." Her eyes lifted toward the master's mansion, its windows glowing with warm candlelight, the sound of drunken laughter drifting out like everything inside it was untouched by the torment happening outside. "He gonna die," Lena continued, "but not before he understands." Elijah exhaled, a slow hiss. "Then let's begin." They moved like smoke thin, silent, impossible to catch. Lena led them through the pecan trees, across the moonlit yard, up the slope toward the horse stables. Every step tightened the thread, pulling them toward the final act they'd been building since the first lash hit the first back that morning. When they reached the back of the mansion, they dropped to the ground. Inside, the master's voice boomed loud, laughing, full of himself. Music drifted. He was hosting one of his late evening gatherings for river merchants, drinking himself stupid, bragging about cotton numbers and punishment techniques like they were accomplishments. Jonas's jaw tightened. "He ain't even done remembering our names." "No," Lena whispered, eyes narrowed. "But he will." She motioned them forward. They slipped along the brick wall toward the basement door, the one the master believed no one knew how to unlock. But Lena had watched his keys, watched his patterns, watched the way he forgot to check behind him. She slid a thin bone pick between the latch and hinge. 2 twists. 1 gentle pull. The door clicked. Inside, the air was thick, damp, carrying the heavy scent of earth. The basement was used to store aging tobacco barrels, and the soundproof stone walls had been chosen intentionally. "Good," Elijah murmured. "Nobody gone hear the start, but someone would hear the end." They set their plan in motion with practiced precision. Jonas tied a rope to the iron hooks in the ceiling. Elijah secured the door from the inside. Abram poured water into a wooden bucket, the only mercy they would allow the master. Caleb tightened his grip on the whip in his hand, knuckles white. Moses knelt, testing the strength of the floor beams directly overhead. "What you looking for?" Caleb whispered. Moses gave a grim smile. "Where his chair gone fall when we pull him down here?" Lena closed her eyes. Tomorrow, at dawn, the world would wake to something no plantation had ever seen. When she opened them again, the darkness felt ready. Everything was ready. All that remained was the master himself. Night fell over Blackbriar Plantation like a curtain soaked in tar, thick, suffocating, and heavy with a promise. A promise that something was coming. Something no whip, no master, no overseer could stop. The air tasted of copper and damp earth, and somewhere in the distance a whip poor will called once, then went silent, as if frightened by what it sensed. Caleb stood behind the smokehouse, hidden in the shadow of the brick wall, watching the main house windows glow with lamplight. His breaths came slow and controlled. His hands were steady. The bruises on his back, still raw from the master's rage 2 nights earlier, itched beneath his shirt, but he ignored the pain. Pain meant nothing now. What mattered was the plan, and tonight, that plan moved forward. Footsteps approached, a soft shuffle, familiar. Caleb didn't turn until he heard the whisper, "It's done." Isaac stepped out from between the trees, his face pale in the moonlight. In his hand, he held a length of rope, the same rope Willis, the overseer, always wrapped around his shoulder when he stalked the fields. But this rope looked different, now cut in half, frayed, stained dark. Caleb nodded. "You're certain he won't wake?" Isaac swallowed hard. "He won't be waking from anything again." There was no triumph in his voice. Only exhaustion, fear, a trembling resolve. Caleb placed a steadying hand on Isaac's shoulder. It had to be him. Willis was the one who whipped the children, the one who dragged your sister by her hair. He made his choices. He paused, voice lowering. "We're making ours." Isaac nodded slowly. From the other side of the smokehouse, another figure emerged, Sarah. Her eyes darted constantly, searching the shadows, but her expression was hardened, sharpened into something fierce. "I put the whips where you said," she whispered. "Behind the shed. Ain't nobody found 'em yet." She hesitated. "You think the master suspects anything?" Caleb shook his head. "Not yet. He thinks we're too scared to breathe without permission." Sarah gave a humorless laugh. "He gon' learn." A lantern flickered from across the yard. The master's silhouette appeared briefly on the veranda, pacing like a restless wolf. The faint sound of glass shattering drifted through the evening air. He was drinking again, harder than usual. "Good," Caleb murmured. Let him drown himself in it, because by dawn, he wouldn't be breathing. The 3 slipped into the cornfield, staying low between the tall stalks. Their footsteps brushed softly over the soil. The field was their sanctuary, their council chamber, their battlefield. At the center clearing, 3 more waited: Mary, Silas, and old Ruth. The eldest among them, eyes clouded but mind sharp as ever, lifted her chin. "So," she rasped, "is it truly begun?" Caleb inhaled once, then spoke. "It's begun. Willis is dealt with. Next is Turner." Mary shivered at the name Turner, the second overseer, the one with a limp and a temper that flared hotter than the forge. He carried a whip like it was an extension of his arm. "Turner always walks the grounds at night," Silas warned, "looking for trouble to make. Then we give him something to find," Caleb answered. Old Ruth nodded approvingly. "For 50 years I've been waiting for someone to rise. Tonight I see it." The wind stirred gently, rustling the leaves above them like a whisper of approval. Caleb crouched down and drew lines in the dirt. The cabins, the main house, the overseer's barracks, and most important of all, the shed where the master kept his supply of whips. 5, always 5. He'd bragged that number meant precision. "1 slave for each lash I give." He used to sneer. But Caleb had turned that arrogance into a weapon. "Before dawn," he said slowly, "all 5 whips will be wrapped round the master's neck." A tense silence fell over the group, not out of fear, out of awe, out of the realization that this was no longer a whispered dream, no longer a fantasy shared around dying fires or prayed for during sleepless nights. This was happening. Tonight, the hunters would become the hunted. Sarah leaned forward. What about the children? What if things go wrong? Caleb's jaw tightened. Nothing happens to them. They're hiding in the root cellar behind cabin 3, locked from the inside. They stay there until it's over. Mary exhaled in relief. Good. Real good. Old Ruth lifted her hand. Everything you're building, it'll change the world for them if you succeed. He nodded once. I will. Thunder rumbled in the distance, low, distant, like a warning rolling across the sky. It's time, Caleb said. They moved through the yard like shadows, silent, breathless, invisible. Turner was indeed patrolling, lantern swinging as he limped between the rows of tools. The iron buckle of his belt glinted briefly as he passed. Caleb signaled with 2 fingers. Isaac disappeared behind the hog pen. Silas circled toward the woodpile. Sarah crept up behind Caleb, gripping a heavy wooden handle, one of the tools Turner himself had used to strike her brother. As Turner paused to spit tobacco into the dirt, Caleb stepped out from behind the barn. Evenin', Turner. The overseer spun, startled. What the hell you doing out after hours? He never finished. Isaac dropped the rope around his throat at the same moment Silas kicked the lantern from his hand. The flame burst out, lighting the ground for only a heartbeat before the darkness swallowed everything again. Turner clawed at the rope, choking and stumbling. Sarah stepped forward, voice cold as winter. This one's for my brother. If we too. The blow landed hard. Turner fell to his knees, then to his side. Then he fell silent. Caleb knelt beside the body and took the second whip from Turner's belt. 2 down, he said quietly. They dragged the overseer's corpse behind the shed, where Willis already lay side by side, the 2 men who had carved suffering into generations. Old Ruth murmured, "The earth will remember them different than they remembered themselves." And Caleb whispered, "Tomorrow dawn, the master joins them." The sky was turning the faintest shade of charcoal gray when they returned to the cabins. A thin mist rolled over the ground. No birds sang. The world itself felt like it was holding its breath. Caleb looked at the remaining 4 slaves gathered around him, faces determined, eyes burning. "Before the sun rises," he said softly, "the master will choke on the same cruelty he gave us." And for the first time anyone could remember, no one looked afraid. Night fell over the plantation like a dropped curtain, quick, heavy, and full of waiting. The cicadas quieted. The dogs had long stopped barking. And in the dark space between the big house and the quarters, 5 shadows moved with purpose. Elias led them, his gait steady despite the lash scars still burning across his back. Behind him walked Josiah, Caleb, little Tom, and Reuben, the 5 men Master Harrow had whipped until their skin peeled like wet paper, until they screamed, until their voices broke, until one of them, little Tom, went silent entirely, passing out still tied to the post. Yet tonight, not one of them spoke. They didn't need to. Each man carried something in his hands, thin strips of leather, coiled rawhide cords, pieces of rope taken from the barn, belts stolen from overseers' rooms. Individually, they were useless. Together, they were a sentence. They had decided earlier that evening, crowded into Elias's narrow cabin while the lanterns smoked above their heads. They sat in a tight circle, shoulders touching, a single shared thought moving between them like a pulse. Tonight, Caleb whispered it first. Josiah nodded next. Tom lifted his chin. Reuben clenched his jaw. Elias, silent, placed his hand flat on the table. They braided the cords together there, 5 lengths of pain woven into one. Now the weapon hung coiled around Elias's shoulder like a sleeping serpent. The noose of 5. They reached the big house from the side path, avoiding the gravel that would crunch beneath their feet. The windows glowed faintly, the light of Master Harrow's private study drifting out into the humid night. Inside, he was drinking he always drank after nightfall, and his footsteps were uneven as he paced. Elias motioned with 2 fingers. Josiah and Caleb circled behind the house. Tom and Reuben crept toward the front porch. Elias went for the back door. There was no hesitation. Not anymore. Master Harrow had crossed the invisible line the day he whipped all 5 of them in a single afternoon, whipped them until the cane snapped, until he fetched another, until even the overseers looked away. He had done it because his pride had bruised, because they didn't bow fast enough, because cruelty made him feel something. And tonight, they would return that something. Elias slipped inside first. The study door was open. Harrow's shadow swung on the wall wide, staggering, unpredictable. Elias stepped closer, timing his breaths with Harrow's uneven mutterings. Then a floorboard groaned. Harrow froze, turned, and locked eyes with Elias. For half a second, silence reigned thick, choking, electric. Harrow's expression twisted. "You, what are you doing in my—" He didn't finish, because Josiah seized him from behind, one hand clamped over his mouth. Caleb rushed in next, forcing his arms down. Tom and Reuben grabbed his legs, carrying him like a thrashing hog. Elias pulled the braided noose from around his shoulder. Harrow saw it. His eyes widened. He tried to scream. They dragged him through the study, through the hall, out the front door, and into the yard where the moon hung low and swollen. The great oak tree stood waiting, older than the plantation, older than Harrow's bloodline, older than every cruelty buried in its soil. They threw him onto the ground beneath it. Harrow kicked, clawed, sputtered through the hand, still covering his mouth. His voice was high, nearly breaking with every muffled plea. Elias stepped calmly forward and crouched beside him. "You remember this morning?" he asked softly. Harrow's wild eyes showed he did. Elias nodded. "Good." He wrapped the noose around the man's neck, not tight yet, just enough for Harrow to feel the weight of it. The master trembled violently. "You used 5 whips," Elias murmured. "We brought you 5 hands." One by one, the men stepped forward and gripped the rope. Josiah, Caleb, Tom, Reuben, and finally Elias. Harrow shook his head wildly, tears cutting pale streaks through the dust on his cheeks. But none of the 5 men had any mercy left. Elias lifted his hand, and together, in one slow, deliberate motion, they pulled. Harrow's cry choked off instantly. His feet kicked up shallow bursts of dirt. His hands clawed the earth, then the air, then nothing at all. The rope stretched upward as they hauled him until his weight hung fully from the branch. The tree barely creaked. They stood shoulder to shoulder, breathing hard, watching his body twitch and then go slack. The same silence that filled the plantation after every whipping now wrapped around them, but this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't fear. It was completion. Tom exhaled shakily. "Is it done?" Elias stared at the lifeless shape swaying above them. "No," he said. "Not yet." He pulled the rope back down slowly, carefully, and when Harrow's body reached the ground, the 5 men tied the rope differently, tighter, shorter, crueler. Then, with grim purpose, they looped the rest of the rope around Harrow's wrists, binding his own stiff hands against his throat, and tied the 5 whips he had used that morning directly around his neck, a necklace of his own violence. Caleb spit into the dust near his feet. "Now it's done." But Elias shook his head. "Now," he said quietly. "It begins." The night settled over the plantation like a shroud, thick, airless, a darkness that pressed on the lungs as if trying to warn anyone still awake to stay inside. Even the insects had gone silent. No scratching of beetles on bark, no chirping of crickets in the tall grass, no bullfrogs humming from the swamp. It was as though the land itself knew what was coming. What happened to Master Halston at dawn had not been a miracle. It had not been luck. It had not been divine justice, not entirely. It had been built, step by step, by the 5 men he thought he owned. And while the sunrise found him crawling across the dirt with 5 leather whips cinched around his neck like tightening serpents, the night before had been the turning point. Because the night before was the first time the slaves' quarters held no fear. They gathered in the old smokehouse, its walls long rotted, its roof sagging but still holding warmth from years of cured pork. No overseers checked this place anymore. They thought it useless. They thought the slaves too tired to meet at night. They were wrong. Carver stood at the center of the group, hands trembling as he placed the bundle on the ground. 5 pieces of cut rope, 5 metal buckles, and a long strip of cloth with dried blood embedded into the weave. The blood belonged to May. A murmur swept the circle. Torin bowed his head. Elias closed his eyes. Ruel muttered a prayer so old no one else recognized the words. Abram clenched his fists until the knuckles cracked. Carver's voice broke the silence. "Tomorrow," he said, "we finish what he started." Elias swallowed. And what he started was hell. The men nodded. Because Master Halston had not merely whipped them, he had tried to break them for daring to shield May from his rage. He had dragged her out, made an example of her, and left her barely breathing. May was alive now, but she was silent. Too silent, and that silence had become their fire. What they planned did not need to be said in full. Words would make it too real, too dangerous. But they understood each other without speaking. Halston would not live to see another sunrise. Ruel was the one who mapped the coils and friction knots. He had been a rope maker before being chained. Abram knew where Halston stored the whips, 5 of them each tagged with the name of the slave it belonged to. The master liked order. He liked knowing whose blood stained which leather. Torin knew the back routes around the quarters, the blind spots between patrols. Elias could mimic footsteps and voices well enough to lure someone exactly where they needed him. And Carver carried the hatred, not hot and wild, but cold, sharpened, the kind that waited. The moon slipped behind clouds. The men stepped out of the smokehouse and dispersed without a word. Carver returned to May's side. Her breathing was shallow, her face still marked by a welt across her cheek, but her eyes fluttered open when she felt his shadow. "You're leaving again," she whispered. "Only for a little," he said gently. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where Halston's big house loomed like a ghost against the horizon. "He won't stop," she murmured. "Not after today." Carver swallowed, voice low. "He'll stop." May searched his face as though she already knew the truth. Then she nodded once and closed her eyes. Midnight came. Then 1. Then 2. Torin tapped twice on each door of the quarters as signal. Then he led the group silently through the fields. Their feet left no prints in the dew. The north side overseer slept drunk. They knew this because Elias had made sure his flask remained full. They circled behind the barn, where Halston's whips hung drying on a rack. They stole all 5, each man holding the weapon carved for his own back. Then they approached the house. Elias stepped ahead and knocked softly on the kitchen door. A pause. Then the old housekeeper cracked it open, lantern in hand. "Master?" she whispered. Elias mimicked Halston's voice perfectly, roughened and impatient. "Come here." She opened the door wide, but Carver slipped behind her, hand covering her mouth, lowering her gently to the ground. She fainted rather than fought. "Good," Torin whispered. "No blood." They entered through the kitchen hallway, moving like shadows. Upstairs, Halston slept. Their footsteps were silent. Carver was the one who opened it. The master slept with his mouth half open, drool on the pillow, one hand hanging off the edge of the bed. He looked small, weak, mortal, and yet every scar on their bodies throbbed at the sight of him. Ruel secured the first loop. Abram fastened the second. Torin tightened the third. Elias the fourth. Carver tied the last one, pulling until Halston gagged and his eyes snapped open in terror. He didn't scream, not at first. Shock paralyzed him. Then Carver lifted the ends of the whips. "You liked these," Carver whispered. "Used 'em near every day." Halston's legs kicked uselessly, the whips dragging him across the floor. "But tonight," Carver continued, "you gonna learn what it feels like when 5 men decide they done being scared." Halston tried to speak, but the leather around his throat stole his breath. The night swallowed the rest.